Welcome to another video, welcome to another homemade synth video. This one is the promised follow-up to my previous one about analog or additive synthesis sound design. This is the FM, and basically, I'm hoping to demystify FM because I think it gets a bit of a bad sort of bum rap. It is definitely trickier than additive. But you can actually, if you just change the way you think about it, it really is very, very similar. And hopefully I'll show you that in this. Now, very, very quick recap. You can either watch some of my other videos or any number of videos online. What is FM synthesis? It's basically just modifying the frequency of one wave with another wave. Now, if it's low frequency, we call it vibrato. If it's high frequency, we call it FM. So, for example, nice sine wave. Let's decide to put some vibrato. Now, just in terms of the terminology, we're going to call the amount that it goes up and down the depth. Okay, that's the depth. And then, if we, that one we'll go to, and this, the speed which is going up and down, that's the modulator frequency. Now, if that modulator frequency is a multiple of the carrier being the one you hear, then we call it a ratio. Well, it's always a ratio, but we call it an integer ratio. So now, if I go fast enough, it stops sort of sounding like vibrato and starts sounding like a different sound. So let's that one. Let's change the depth again. So, and you can see the FFT is going a bit weird. It's getting fatter there because it can't actually display the harmonics quickly enough. But anyway, so that's the terminology. So we have depth and we have ratio. All right. Now that we've got that out the way, let's have a look. Why do I say FM is start again. Why do I say FM is like standard subtractive? Well, that's because realistically it is. It's just a different way of getting there. So if you, and this is also a very simple FM, and it's not really even FM, it's most FM synths are actually phase modulation. In other words, instead of technically modifying the frequency, they're modifying the phase, which means where it is in the waveform. It actually is exactly the same. It sounds exactly the same. It's just a slight differentiation in how it's actually created. So now, this is technically phase modulation, but it is FM. The DX7, a famous FM synth, was actually phase modulation as well. Anyway, let's go. So if we are to initialize an FM sound, that's how we do it on this little one. Now, this sound is using a modulator frequency, like a vibrato frequency, that's exactly the same as the carrier being the sine wave that you hear. It's also at a depth of a half. So maximum is 1, just on this synth. Minimum is 0, which means no modulation. It's got a half. So let's have a look. So that's the waveform we end up with. So our fundamental is actually only on a half. The first harmonic is about 1. The second harmonic is, say, about a third, and there's another one. But that's what happens when you modulate a wave very, very fast. So the sine wave starts going up, then the modulator brings it back down, and then so we're changing that sine wave by modulating its phase, or its frequency, if you like to think about it that way. So let's now go back. How can I say that this is really the same as a subtractive synth? Well, let's work out what parts of FM are the same as subtractive. So in this 2-operator synth, you have a carrier, which is the actual sine wave you hear. You have a modulator, which is the frequency that's modulating the carrier. And then you actually have a thing called feedback, which is where the modulator goes back on itself to create even more complex harmonics. Now, that in itself I would call a complex oscillator, but it's really very little different on a normal subtractive synth from choosing sawtooth, triangle, square, pulse, sine. You actually choose a straight waveform. In FM, I would equate the oscillator to the ratio. Okay, now let's just think about that for a bit. So ratio, I mean, I heard that, there's depths and all that sort of stuff. What's the point of having that? Well, let's have a look. If I go now to, here's the ratio. Now I will say, on this synth here, I have an odd feature. I allow half harmonics, but I don't have a full wave of the half harmonic. I have up until one full waveform of the carrier. So you actually end up with a really, really complex sort of wave. So I won't go into that anymore, other than to say that this little synth supports these weird half harmonics, but I'm only going to go up in the integer ones. So we start off, okay, there's a half. So there's our one that we saw, that's our default sound. Now what I'm saying is, as you change the ratio, you change the sound. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see the harmonics. So only look at the full ones, don't look at the half ones because they go really crazy. But have a look at those pair of harmonics. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. So you can see they keep going down. So it's a different sound because it just changes the harmonics, where they are, the frequency. So I equate that to the waveform. So you can actually choose the type of sound you want by choosing your ratio. Okay, we've got that. So let's go to a 1-to-1. That's our default sound. We'll OK that. Right. So we've got our waveform. We can choose the type of sound by where we place the harmonics. In other words, the harmonics go up and down with the ratio. All right. What's the next part of subtractive synth? It's filter. Filter makes, that is basically the life and blood of a subtractive synth. Well, guess what? It's also the lifeblood of an FM synth. I'll show you why. On my little implementation, each oscillator has its own envelope. In other words, that controls the depth or the volume, if you like, of that oscillator. So the first one is just your sine wave. So for example, here's our wave. If I choose the volume of that wave, as I turn the volume up, what do you notice? The waveform stays exactly the same as it normally is, just gets smaller. Doesn't matter what the other thing's doing, this is just getting louder and softer. Now in subtractive synth, even though I said I was about to talk about the filter or the, let's keep on that, that is your VCA. That's the volume of your sound. So part of your subtractive synth is a VCA, a filter, and a waveform. We've got the waveform covered with our ratio. We've got the VCA covered with the envelope for your carrier. So let's look at the envelope for the modulator. So we go back, we're at full volume, let's say oscillator 2. Now, have a look carefully. As we go up, see the harmonics coming up, and then some weird stuff happens, but we get more and more harmonics until we reach the end. So as we increase the depth, we're actually increasing the number of harmonics. Now, in subtractive, that is called filtering. Now, there are some strange things, and this is a very special ratio because as you increase the depth, the fundamental can actually get negatively, well, basically it goes down because of you're adding two different phase waveforms. Now, okay, I better explain that seeing I've said it. FM, basically all it does is you have your carrier, and then whatever the modulating frequency, you add a harmonic at the modulation frequency plus the carrier. So you remember when we were going through the ratios, those two little lines moved up and up and up? That's because the line sits at your original frequency plus some number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc., times the modulator. So we've got a modulator of 1 is to 1. So you have a carrier, and then one lot later, then another, then another, then another. Of course, that hopefully you recognize that as a sawtooth. But the trick is it also goes backwards, negative frequencies. So you'll go the fundamental back to DC, one further, one further, one further. And you say, well, negative frequency, all that happens there is it sounds exactly the same as a positive, it just inverts the phase, which means when you add a negative frequency and a positive frequency, they cancel each other out. Okay, so we've got that out of the way. When you adjust the depth, all it's doing is it's increasing the levels of all those harmonics. When you have a low, so let's go back to it. So 2. So when I have no depth, we're a sine wave. As I increase the depth, you can see the harmonics getting higher, and you can now start seeing higher harmonics coming in. Okay? But look carefully, there's our fundamental. Watch what happens. As I start increasing it, see the fundamental goes down until a point where it's 0. Then it starts going up again. Okay, that's because our negative frequency is getting higher and higher as we increase it, and that negative frequency is at the same frequency as our fundamental, meaning it actually cancels each other out until the point where they're equal. Then the negative frequency is actually louder than our normal frequency, and so it goes up again. The Fourier transform just sees as a line. Your ear just hears it as a frequency, but in reality it's a negative phase. That's why the waveform looks so weird and wonderful. So we've got all that out of the way. So bottom line, what I'm saying is the envelope for your modulator is your filter. Now let's prove that. So first of all, there's our sine wave. What we're going to do is let's set the initial value something really high. Okay, I mean that's way up. The waveform looks really weird. If you were to change some of the phases, it doesn't look the way it normally does, but it would be a sort of a sawtoothy wave, a bit abused. So let's just leave it there. So that's sort of sounds a bit sawtoothy. Obviously it doesn't look sawtoothy, but there you go. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to set up an envelope that starts at that sound, so it's instantly up, and it disappears over time. So I'm going to say envelope 2, sustain level 0, and I'm going to say decay level quite long. So this will give you an idea. Now watch carefully. I'll play the note. It'll do that weird and wonderful waveform, and then you'll see all the harmonics disappearing till we get back to our sine because the depth is 0. Now what does that sound like? Right, it sounds like a filter. And if you do it properly, I mean that was very slow, but if I was to say set the depth a lot faster, it's got a complex sound at the top going down to a sine. Now of course I could also I'll make that a bit faster maybe. So 2, let's make it, a bit slower. And I don't want it to go back to a sine wave, so I'm actually going to set the level a bit higher. So I want it to go to that sort of almost sawtoothy wave. So I probably made that the decay too fast. So there you go. That's the filter. Now we can also add a bit of VCA instead of being instantly on. We're still going to have our modulator instantly on, so it goes from that waveform, but let's now make the attack of the sound a bit slower. So there you go. There is a sound that sounds remarkably like a subtractive synth, taking a complex waveform like a sawtooth, filtering it down, and having a VCA shape the volume of the sound. Great. Well, there's still one more trick, and that is the feedback. Now, in analog terms, I consider the feedback like a wave folder. So what it does is it changes the modulator from a sine to something far more complicated. So let's look. So that's with the feedback at 0. Now watch what happens as I turn the feedback up. Now for those of you familiar with wave folders, it doesn't look dissimilar to things like wave folders. So what you can do is use that as well. So let's also do, we're going to go crazy. So the beginning of the sound, the wave folder. It's in there. What I want to do is put the wave folder back to 0. So I'm going to say envelope, sustain level 0. I'm going to make the decay quite quick. So it's going to be like a... So you can hear it sort of has that blow, that sort of bit at the beginning. That's like our wave folder quickly going from folded to back to normal. Then we have our filter and we have our VCA. So cool. All right, that's the basics. Let's see what can you actually do with it. Now, in a proper, expensive FM synth, you have more than 2 oscillators. Now, that's no different to having an analog synth with, say, 3 oscillators. You can combine those oscillators, you can use those oscillators to modulate the others, etc. No different with FM. The 2-operator FM is very much like a 1-oscillator subtractive synth. So much easier to actually understand. Now, you can use any FM synth. If you've got one at home and you've always been scared to program it, you can turn all of the volumes or all of the depths of all the operators down to 0 except the 2. So you can have it you can actually do exactly the same as I'm doing here on your own synth if you turn the rest of them down and just choose a carrier and a modulator. So let's do something a bit more interesting than, say, our I don't even know what that sound is. So let's initialize the FM back to our 1-to-1 at half depth. Now we're going to choose our oscillator type. So remember, the ratio is akin to an oscillator type, like a square, whatever. So we start off, there's our strange half, 1, 1.5, 2. Ah, look at that. That already looks a bit square wavy. So 1-to-1 gives us something that sounds not unlike a sawtooth. 2-to-1 gives us something that doesn't sound too much different to square wave. So let's have a look now. What we want to do is let's change the modulation of change the depth of the modulator, because that's like a filter. So at 0, we're a sine. In fact, I'll make it a bit higher so it's easy to see. And then we're putting in all our frequencies of a square, and then we're actually going a bit crazy. So it's going even higher. So that's you can hear the very high frequencies. We want to make a square wave, so let's do something that's a reasonable square, but I reckon we can get better. So what we can do is, why don't we go a little bit like this, and let's see if our wave shaper can get us better. So look at that. wave shaper at 0, wave shaper at crazy. So the wave shaper equivalent is actually getting us quite a good square wave. Look, in our additive we only have 3 harmonics. We've now got harmonics 1, 3, 5. We've now got 7, 9, and there's actually an 11 there. I don't know if you can see it in the video, but there's a little tiny bump. So we've got significantly more harmonics, and it looks like a much better square wave, and it sounds the same. No. Yeah, something like a square wave out of a old video game. Now, that's our oscillator. So we've actually used our subtractive type oscillator change. We've decided a 2-to-1 ratio, which we've decided is like our square wave. We've chosen the filter and the wave folder to give us a great square wave. Now, that's just an on-off. So now we'll choose our VCA. So what we're going to do is have a little bit of a little bit of attack, a little bit of release. So that's our VCA. You know what? I've also decided I want the square wave to come in slowly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change this. So our depth, I'm also going to set an attack of reasonably fast and a release reasonably fast. Now there's a little tiny click there, and that's because we've left our wave folder, so we're still folding effectively the filtered wave. So there's a little trick. Also, basically envelope 3, instantly on, slow to go off. So there is our clarinet sound, and as you know from any of the videos I've done, the clarinet is pretty much a square wave that you filter. The filter comes on reasonably quickly, stays up, and goes down reasonably quickly. So there is an FM sound, a bit of reverb. Oh. There you are. So we've used our FM sound design where we have treated each of the components just like a subtractive synth and done exactly what we've done for the subtractive synth. We chose a square wave. We chose a filter that comes in and out to give us the sort of the onset and offset of the noise. We've chosen a VCA that's not an instantaneous on, it's a quick on and a quick release. And we've done exactly the same as we've done for a subtractive synth. And to be honest, exactly the same as we've done for an additive synth to get the same sound. So that's why hopefully we've demystified it a bit, and at least for 2 operator, it gives you something to play with. It's actually, it really is that simple. Once you get your mind around what all these operators and modulators are, that's it. You can go crazy, same as you can on an analog synth. You can take, on the Blue Marvin, you can have oscillator 1 modulated from oscillator 2, which is modulated from oscillator 3, which is modulated by an LFO, and you can get some really crazy sounds. But you can also just use 1 oscillator, make a nice sound. You can use 2 and mix them together slightly and get a beautiful sound. You can do exactly the same with FM. The advantage of having it, if you imagine you had 6 oscillators in FM, so 3 carriers, each modulated, you could choose the attacks and decay. So the beginning of the sound is 1 oscillator, for use of a better word, the middle and the end. So you can actually sort of choose and sculpt the sound very, very simply. And that's what a lot of these sounds are. So just before we go, we'll do one last one. I'll just press that just to make sure it doesn't go to sleep. What's the thing that everybody loves about FM? It's chimey sounds, that sort of thing. So let's just quickly do one. So long press, initialize. So there you go. We've got our ratio 1. Now, a chime uses a high ratio. We're going to use 7:1. I think that's in fact exactly what I did when I did a chime sound on the Blue Marvin. So let's choose the ratio. 1/2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see those going up. 6, 7. Okay, so we'll accept that. There's a 7:1 ratio. That's our oscillator sound. So, okay, we can if we want. Let's just try and see what happens if we filter it. So sine wave up to crazy. We'll consider that. That's sort of, you got to remember, this is just the sound. So that's good. Let's have a look and see if our wave folder brings anything to the party. So let's look at it. Maybe it does, but you know what? I'm going to leave it. So no wave folding, just our oscillator, and I'm now going to filter and VCA it. So the first thing I can do is let's just use a stock standard, what we call our additive envelope. So that the initial goes up before this one, and then it goes etc to emulate a filter. I'm going to use a pluck, so everything starts off at maximum and then it goes down. So we've got no feedback, all we've got are these two. So the sound's going to go up and die away. The depth is going to die away a bit quicker, so at the very end we'll end up with a sine wave. So let's do that. One of our built-in, so long press. Now we've got a pluck. Now if you look carefully, you can see exactly what we're saying. So as the waveform progresses, the volume is decreasing slower than the filter. So we end up at the very end with a sine wave. There. Watch, let's see if I can. There we are. So at the end, we've ended up with a sine wave, which is exactly what we've done. We've chosen that. Now, you can play around. Again, this is now, think about it subtractively. I want a different sound. I want something like a xylophone, which has a big initial hit and ends up pretty much sounding just like a sine wave. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the modulator die down quicker. So at the moment it's dying down slowly-ish. I'm going to say modulator envelope, decay quicker. I'll turn down the reverb. So I bumped the camera. Turn down the reverb just so you can hear it a bit. So now you can hear that lovely chimey, harmonically rich sound at the very beginning, but it very quickly ends up as a sine. Something like that anyway. So there you go. It's exactly the same. If you just change your perception just that little bit, FM is no different to subtractive. You can do all the same tricks, you can make the same sounds. Just remember, the ratio is your oscillator, the depth of your modulator is your filter, and your feedback is like your wave folder. If you go for that, FM, all of a sudden, it should suddenly, the light bulb will come on, and you know what? You'll be able to make some amazing sounds with FM. And hopefully it'll actually get people who have these synths at home who've never touched it because it's too difficult. You'll be able to have a play. And I mean, how easy was it to make that sound? That's quite a nice sound. Anyway, I'll leave you with that. Hopefully people can get something out of that. And hopefully I have demystified FM just a little bit. If I have, then I'm happy because I've done what I intended to do. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.